my chapter, I discuss three different issues. First, whether it's actually a use of a concept of democracy, since there are so many different meanings attached to it. Second, I also discussed the different clusters of meanings that are attached to the concept of democracy. And third, I discussed two different ways that we can combine different attributes of democracy with each other. So regarding the first question, should we at all use the concept of democracy, since there are so many different meanings attached to the concept? My argument here is yes. Just because many different people have different views of democracy doesn't mean that the concept is not useful for scientific purposes and for everyday usage. We should not be very clear when we discuss democracy. So what do we mean with democracy? What is the core definition, and what kind of features, attributes do we attach to the concept? So I would say it's still meaningful to make use of it, and we should make use of it because it is a very important aspect of our societal life. So with regard to the second question, what is democracy? I present 7 different conceptions of democracy in my chapter that I find represent predominant perspectives in the literature. So I distinguish between electoral democracy, liberal democracy, egalitarian democracy, participatory democracy, deliberative democracy, and last but not least, a contrast between majoritarian democracies and consensual democracies. They vary from each other in different ways, but what they have in common is what I call the electoral core. The electorate or the population in general should be allowed to vote for the political officials and who should have government power. That is really the core of democracy. So where liberal democracy, what it adds to this core is a focus on civil liberties and the rule of law as some core aspects. Participatory democracy says by the label participation in that citizens should be engaged in all kinds of ways and at all levels in a polity. In a tradition, looking at egalitarian democracy, what they really highlight is that one thing is to have equal votes, another thing is to have equal political influence. But we know that the different kinds of resources have an impact on how much political influence you have. Deliberative democracy, it has some other standards. So what is important here is that the discourse, the negotiations and the deliberation between different parties, groups in society should fulfill some standards. General interest of society is very important. And then we have the contrast between majoritarian and consensual democracy, where one perspective says, well, this is a 50% plus one voter. That is sufficient to get things through. And whereas the consensual perspective is the more the merrier. And these two contrasting ideals, the reason behind them is that with the majoritarian perspective, it's very much about efficiency. If you have very few veto players and you just have this principle that a small majority can decide, you can be more efficient and you can get to better political results. And it's easier for the electorate after a government has been in power to assign the responsibility. On the other hand, supporters of the consensual perspective say that the more people you have included through your representatives, the better the solutions will be for bigger parts of society. As we see here, all these different perspectives share this electoral core of democracy. So these free and fair elections is something they all emphasize as important, but then they differ on what should then be added to this core. But these additional features can be combined in different ways. So one way to combine them is to say, well, we try to understand them as distinct as possible. The problem is, however, that these things sometimes overlap. But if we can then establish a hierarchical order going from this electoral core and adding additional layers in a meaningful way. So that would mean that we would have a kind of a hierarchical, cumulative understanding of democracy, where we go from electoral democracy in a Finn understanding, then what Robert Dahl would call a polyarchy, then liberal democracy, and maybe social democracy at the end. This approach also has some disadvantages, because it requires that you should be able to establish this hierarchy. And the further you move up, the further features you add to this understanding of democracy, the more controversial it gets. So is rule of law more important than the distribution of social resources? How does deliberation fit into all of this? So there's no perfect way, and this both applies to the conceptualization of democracy, but also how to combine these different features of democracy with each other. So what I end my chapter arguing in favor of clarity. So what is really important when we work with the concept of democracy is to be clear from the beginning about what we mean with democracy and how we treat democracy. And then if you don't get too far away from basic understandings of the democracy and how to treat them, I think we are on a good track.